Some people today, even historians, talk about America's founding fathers as being mostly deists who didn't believe in the Christian God. In other words, they were supposedly unbelievers, not Christians. But is that historically accurate? Many years ago, Kirk Cameron interviewed me about America's Judeo-Christian roots. First, we talked about the Christian faith of George Washington, and now we pick up the conversation turning to the others who helped found America.
Okay, what about all of the other founding fathers? I know that the Pilgrims clearly had a strong faith in the God of the Bible. What about the other founding fathers besides George Washington?
Well, I think if you look at American history in the beginning, there's two major eras. There's the era of the settlers, including the Pilgrims and the Puritans, Quakers, and other groups, many of which came for specifically, explicitly Christian reasons. By the time you get to the founders, approximately 150 years later or so, you have a group of people, group of men of the founding fathers who have been affected to some degree by what's been called the Enlightenment. But there's a misunderstanding about this because there are certain aspects of the Enlightenment that were definitely Christian-based as opposed to atheistic-based. So Voltaire, for example, the French skeptic, he would represent the atheistic version of the Enlightenment. But John Locke, Sir William Blackstone, these are often categorized as Enlightenment thinkers. But these guys definitely believed in Jesus Christ, and they believed in the Bible. John Locke even wrote a book called The Reasonableness of Christianity. And so by the time you get to the founding fathers, you have approximately 250 men that we could call founding fathers, from the First Continental Congress, 1774, to roughly 1800. And David Barton, who's done so much research on this, said that of those 250 men that we'll call the founding fathers, at most we can identify 12 that would have questionable beliefs. In other words, all the rest of them, 95%, would affirm the basic Christian doctrines. They were members of Trinitarian churches in good standing.
What was the Enlightenment?
Well, the Enlightenment, so named by people arrogantly, frankly, looking back at people who believed in revelation as being inferior or whatever. The Enlightenment was an intellectual movement that started to move away from God to some degree. But here's the misnomer, or here's the misunderstanding, and that is that not all elements of the Enlightenment were rejecting God and rejecting the Bible and rejecting Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And that's the critical
like the Dark
point.
Ages to me. We got to call it the Dark Ages, when people are trying to move further and further away from God.
I get a kick out of the idea that with all those flying buttresses and all the beauty of Notre Dame, some people are willing to say that that was produced in the Dark Ages. Give me a break. Without CADs, without modern computers, without modern cranes and so forth.
Right.
It's amazing. And so many things were done in an age of faith, and so many positive and humanitarian things were done in the age of faith. And then atheists, in a sense, like parasites, have taken over so many of these institutions. Take the example of higher education. Virtually all of the original colleges and universities founded in America were founded by Christians, by the sweat and hard work of Christians, their donations, and they were founded for Christian purposes. Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, Princeton. And yet what happened was, mostly starting in the mid-19th century, you had this movement away from faith, and liberals like parasites began to work within these institutions and move them away from their original founding. And so much so that today Harvard does not stand for what the Reverend John Harvard gave his donations for that school. That's why they named it after him, because of all those books that he gave. He died very young of consumption. And anyway, bottom line is that he would not agree at all with what is taught at Harvard. And yet for some people to say that Christianity is anti-intellectual or something, oh yeah, they founded, or we founded, Harvard and Princeton and Dartmouth and Yale.
And we could see that the other day when we were at Harvard, and we saw Christus et Ecclesiae.
Yeah, for Christ and His
church.
Yeah.
And it's just all over the walls and even over the law building.
And it even says Veritas for Christo. In other words, truth
right,
for
true.
Christ and the church. And then they cut, in the early part of the 20th century, they cut the veritas all by itself. So now you have truth firmly planted in midair, but without Christ and the church. So it loses its meaning.
You've been watching a vintage, rarely seen interview between Kirk Cameron, the host of the film Monumental, and me about the faith of those who founded this nation. In 1892, when the Supreme Court reviewed all the evidence on America's founding, they concluded this is a Christian nation. And of course, we could add that because this began as a Christian nation, people of all faiths or no faith are welcome here. But through it all, the Judeo-Christian foundation of America remains, although in many quarters that is not recognized. And so we pray for God to revive the work of His hands in this land. For Providence Forum, I'm Dr. Jerry Newcombe.